Our next speaker is Geert Wenes, who's from Cray Incorporated, and he's going to be also talking about deep neural networks. So I hope you brought your appetite for that. Thank you, Geert.
Turn it around. All right. So thank you, Jan. It's really great to be here at the first of what I have no doubt will be a series of good conferences. Can you hear me?
Move it up a little bit.
Move it up a little bit.
Move the microphone up towards you.
I'll leave that to the chairman to make him earn his.
All right.
All right. So I'd like to talk about genetic algorithms as applied to deep neural net learning training. Genetic.
Hold on, you have to use the space bar.
All right. So genetic algorithms are a class of optimization algorithms that kind of take their clue from evolutionary biology or population genetics. A couple of simple mechanisms like mutation, migration, crossover applied to local populations in combination with a fitness function and a certain randomness thrown in sort of determines the best hyperparameter setting for a particular deep neural net model. Why did we do that? We want to improve the time to accuracy as well as the accuracy in deep neural net training, but that was not the primary motivation. The primary motivation was to take the trial and error out of these convolutional neural net training work. Not too many companies have tens data scientists that can work their way and try to understand these deep neural net and train them adequately and know sort of expert-like knowledge. And if you want to sort of make that, move that technology out of the select 5 or 10 companies and move that into a bigger audience, you sort of have to automate that procedure. You have to be able to show that you can do this by mere mortals. The fitness function we use, and I'll show you an example of code at the end of this presentation. If we want to improve time to accuracy, obviously the fitness function will be related to the runtime. If we want to improve accuracy, then obviously the fitness function will be related to the accuracy. The previous speaker talked a little bit about how people train neural nets. We follow the same. We do not change anything in the backpropagation algorithm, so we do a forward and backward sweep. That one sweep is called an epoch in neural net terminology. During that one epoch of training, we sort of develop multiple generations of hyperparameters based upon that fitness function, and we then try to decide which ones to keep and which ones to move on. In particular, we look both at hyperparameters and topology of the neural net. So in convolutional neural net, there's a lot of filtering going on with particular kernel sizes. There's a number of convolutional layers involved. What is the size of the fully connected layers? And what is the dropout rate and the momentum used during training? The previous speaker mentioned that stochastic gradient is a very simple algorithm, or gradient descent is a very simple algorithm. In this particular case, people use it in either a stochastic gradient or in a mini batch type of a setting. People have starting to recognize that more advanced or higher order terms in these gradients or in these algorithms are quite important to speed up convergence and accuracy. So since this is in tools and infrastructure, we did not try to change anything of the well-established toolkits and frameworks that are involved there. We kind of write C wrappers around, provide a generic interface, multi-node support via MPI to sort of advance the scalability of these networks. There's a lot of work in theoretical biology, and there's a lot of work related that in these neural nets and applying genetic algorithms to topology optimization in particular, coming out of Oak Ridge as well. So the data sets that we used, and so the data sets, as you'll see, and then the nets that we used, they're sort of the hello world of the deep learning space these days. Everybody looks first at MNIST and then CIFAR. The very limited number of classes in the digits data set. Smaller resolution. The sizes are not that large, but it's a good initial data set to train on, and some of the techniques used in MNIST and CIFAR obviously work their way in through other algorithms and data sets as well. Again, a similar size. We looked at 10 classes, similar size of training and test images. These ones were color. And we applied two particular neural net architectures to them. One is a 7-layer, a 5 hidden layer net that was not today, that wouldn't qualify as a deep neural net, but at its time it was, I remember the days when perceptrons were popular and that they only have one hidden layer or perhaps more, not too many more. Again, you see the subsampling and the convolution taking place here, and kind of reference to the previous speaker. A lot of these neural nets, they leverage locality as much as sparsity or other to reduce the problem, especially in whether it's temporal or spatial locality. In this particular case, spatial locality. A much deeper one and a much, I guess, more interesting one, at least from the technologist's point of view, is of course the residual deep learning neural net. That's a 110-layer one coming out of Microsoft. I believe it set a bunch of records when it first came out. It is a very complicated one, and all these things I said on how do I optimize and the hyperparameter space and the topology of that net sort of come back in full force. One particular interesting feature of ResNet is where you see the dashed line. It has this capability to cut through the layers of the neural net. So it looks like a 34-layer shown, but on various occasions it can sort of cut through that, and that layer so then effectively disappears in the forward and back propagation stage of the training. And so there's a lot of decisions to be made here, right? So what's my filter size, 3x3 convolution, 128, and how do I propagate that through? There are other hyperparameters, of course, like the exact version of your gradient. We saw a previous speaker talk about sigmoids as term of activation function. There's a lot of interest in other than sigmoid activation functions these days because they come with certain drawbacks. And so there's just a lot to deal with. You can say, well, I'll just take Microsoft's neural net and I'll apply it to my problem, but are you really assured then that your problem is sufficiently similar that you can do that with a certain level of accuracy? So we did that, and so first to demonstrate how you can improve, by using genetic algorithms, how you can improve time to accuracy, we took the very simple one, MNIST and TensorFlow, and I'll give you a couple of examples at the end of how the code actually looks and what happens. But you see a number of these layers and the topology got changed a little bit. We take random seeds around the Google published topology, and we vary that a little bit, or actually more than a little bit. In the future, we want to use this in a bit more systematic way than we do it today. And you stay close to what was originally there, but you do see a 70% reduction in training time to a validation accuracy of 99.1%. And so if you want to, let's see if this is the one here. So you can see that you can see that indeed you get that 99+% in about, I would say, 1/3 of the time that it would take. So for a simple convolutional neural net, the validation accuracy can be reduced, with a factor of 2 or 3. that is important because, as we will see, and as was mentioned by the previous speakers, it takes a lot of time to train these neural nets. So these ResNet in particular, we'll see some examples. This is you know, a high performance computing problem almost, especially if you want to scale it to bigger data sets and bigger classes and a larger number of classes. So for CIFAR and ResNet, we were more interested in the final accuracy. Again, we figured out that with a couple of very simple topology changes. Here in particular, these are the names that these layers are typically go by. We can see that the top one classification error shows an absolute reduction of about half or a little bit less than 0.5% and a relative reduction in error of about 7%. And so that is, I think perhaps we're at the point of diminishing returns here in these accuracy in these classification errors. But that you know, with no or very little extra work, that is nothing to sniff at. We also experimented with something with ResNet in particular, where we did two epochs, two sweeps, two forward-backward sweeps. We looked at the best individual in our gene pool, so to speak, and then we basically said, okay, let's take that one now and run a conventional algorithm on this, and let's just see what happens. And so what you see here, the default ResNet. Remember, there are 10 classes, so your error from at epoch 0 is 90%. Got 1 in 10 get correct. After two sweeps, ResNet was down to something like 88. And from there, we started with our best individual, and it quite quickly showed an improvement in a reduction in percent error that then flattened out after a number of 6 to 8 of these sweeps. So the lesson here is that you can get some very quick payoff depending upon where you position your genetic algorithm into the neural net that does not hurt the final accuracy and will definitely improve the time to accuracy. We automated all that as much as we could. This is not supposed to be an exercise in coming up with the best genetic algorithm in the world. There's many, many variations on genetic algorithms. In fact, you can probably do a genetic algorithm on a genetic algorithm to come up with the best possible strategy. This is not the intent here. The intent is basically to make this as hands-off as possible. And so typical parameters used, and you would typically run a few tens of these epochs training sweeps. In each of these epochs, we have a number of generations of hyperparameter pools that we evolve. We evolve quite a number of them. We use a relatively modest size, a number of GPUs. Again, the previous speaker pointed out this can become a very compute-intensive problem, especially for the larger data sets. And we have seen cases not with the genetic algorithm where it takes thousands of these sweeps for a model to sustain sufficient accuracy, and that can take days of compute time on a substantial system. So, an improvement of a factor of 2 in runtime is definitely, if you go to AWS, and an improvement of a factor of 2 in runtime would definitely affect your budget. This is a little bit more complicated than it's supposed to be, but again, to give you a little bit of a flavor, in this particular case, we select on runtime, we determine a fitness function. I think future work will try to we'll try to use something that is more probabilistically sound, and then during, we evolve the population with certain probabilities, mutation and crossover, and then we basically migrate the best population members throughout our system, and the parents die after that. So again, nothing to part of the hyperparameter pool comes from parent A, part of it comes from parent B. Migration is in a well-defined pattern. As I mentioned before, you can obviously experiment with that and see if there's better results to be achieved. All of this sort of points to a couple of conclusions, right? So we really want to simultaneously evolve the hyperparameter space and the topology to search space to maximize training speed or validation accuracy. So it'd be pretty good to sort of, kill two birds with one stone here. We introduced some distributed training nodes via MPI, so that enables larger data parallel training tasks. The level of parallelism is I wouldn't call it trivial, but modest. And we wanted the population size to scale with the machine resources. So we show significantly improved training time for neural net. Less so perhaps in accuracy. We can actually select for individuals who read the target accuracy the fastest. So that was the 2-epoch example. The final accuracy is in relative numbers is a good improvement over the best known topology. We do more hyperparameter optimization than topology optimization. So in cases where a good starting topology is not known a priori, there's other genetic algorithms similar to Mendel that perhaps are more relevant. Again, in the short term, we can do quite a bit to expand that work, but the primary purpose is not necessarily here to be an evangelist for genetic algorithms. The primary purpose here is really to show some low-hanging fruit in infrastructure work. One of the more promising applications is, of course, unsupervised learning. You remember we come up with a fitness function, so obviously there is the potential to use a GAN to use the same fitness function to make this less of a classification, a supervised classification problem, and more of an unsupervised learning problem, in which case you actually would make tremendous progress in especially in convolutional neural net, because again, pointed out by a number of speakers, you really need well-labeled data for these neural nets, and a lot of them for these neural nets to really be effective. So that's really all I have. Again, be happy to take questions.
Let's thank our speaker. I think we have time for about one question. Does anyone have a question?
I didn't make my time.
All right, we have a question here from Jan.
So one of the challenges that I see with some of the learning algorithms is really about the scalability. So you being an HPC person and algorithms here, we have 40, 50 years of working on sort of numerical algorithm scaling and parallelizing. What is your speculation on where we are with deep learning, and are we getting there so that we can use the large infrastructure of these vendors?
So that's somebody with a background in HPC and looks upon these things like gradient descent in a different way than the deep learning people, right, where they have to do stochastic or mini batch type of work, because there's a lot of experimentation going on. Can I increase the size of the mini batch? Can I do leapfrog type of algorithms instead of waiting for, my parallel implementation to synchronize and select the best algorithm? And so that is a lot of, like I said, speculation. There's a lot of research going on there, whether these asynchronous implementations of gradient descent or up to it, right? You come from an HPC background where you do gradient descent through GMRS or whatever, where you do it on the full data set at a high computational cost. But all the nice properties or the theoretical properties of the gradient descent are known in that space. And so there's a bit of a trend going on now that perhaps, especially if your data set isn't that big, that maybe you do a full, GMRS type of parallel implementation, in which case you get like 30 years of incredibly solid library work that you can leverage.
Thank our speaker once again, Geert Wenes.